Hello everybody, welcome to episode 25 of Show Fever. Today we'll be going over a very, very good anime by the name of Orb on the Movements of the Earth. Now, our story starts in, essentially, it's never specifically stated where the story starts, but I believe it is around the early 1400s, like the early 1400s. But so we start off with this character by the name of Rafal. Rafal is a 12-year-old boy who is a very prospective student. He has actually got a slip to go to university at this very young age to study theology, because that's what he's planning on doing, is studying theology. However, one day, his adopted dad, because both of his parents are dead, his adopted dad ends up giving him a letter to go meet with this person who was once acquainted with his father, and he goes to meet this guy, and this guy goes by the name of Hubert. Now, Hubert was released on recantation because he recanted from his heresies and was released back to the public. Now, if someone is accused of heresy twice, they are burned at the stake. So Hubert is released, and then he ends up meeting with Rafal, and they briefly discuss, and Hubert's not a big fan of him at first, but he's like, you know what, let's go out and make observations, because Rafal is a very much in-depth explorer of astronomy, and he uses his astrolabe to make many observations and stuff like that. He's become very in-depth with his observations, and it is very impressive for his age. And Hubert's like, okay, I want to use your eyes for me to make observations, because Hubert was put into prison because of his astronomy views. And so they end up going, and Hubert ends up introducing Rafal to the idea of heliocentrism. Now, in this world, it is very similar to ours, and in the fact that in this time period, geocentrism, which is the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe, was the widely lauded theory on the placement of the solar system and its celestial bodies. And so, therefore, anything that went against that was considered heretical because the church supported geocentrism. Therefore, they saw heliocentrism, which suggested that the sun is at the center of not at the universe, but our solar system, as heretical because it went against church teaching and doctrine. And that's why Hubert was in prison, like I said. And so he's introduced to this idea, and Rafal's like, okay, hold up. I don't actually absolutely believe this at first. But then he gets doing more research and studying it and taking perspectives from this stance. And he's like, oh, this is actually a thing. And Hubert ends up telling him about a stone box. Now, eventually, Hubert is, well, not Hubert, but Rafal is going to the stone box. He's looking through, and he's just absolutely learning, making developments and stuff like that. And eventually, he ends up at his house where Rafal has a book, and this book is one of his, but it's on heliocentrism, and Hubert is around. Well, Hubert isn't around at the moment, but he's confronted by this inquisitor called Noack. Noack is probably my favorite character in all of Orb. He was a phenomenal character. But yeah, so Noack is an inquisitor, and he's like, okay, why do you have this? And Hubert's like, oh, it's mine. So Hubert pulls up, and he sacrifices himself for Rafal, and ultimately ends up getting burned at the stake. So there is the death of Hubert. But this progresses along, and eventually we just see as Rafal eventually makes not a doctorate, but a kind of thesis on heliocentrism, and it's called On the Movements of the Earth. And he ends up completing this. He writes and puts it back in the stone box, because eventually he is caught as well by the Inquisitors. And this is his first charge of what we call a heresy, and they offer him the chance to recant in front of the court. And he goes to do so, and he says, no, my faith is heliocentrism. And then he's sent to prison, and Noack's like, why did you do that? You could have lived your life free, but no, you did this. And and then Rafal kind of went over his dedication to the idea, and he's like, why did you let me have such good wine? Because he had some good wine in there. And Noack's like, it's the last privilege before you go into torture. And Rafal's drinking it. And he offers Noack to come sit with him and do it. And they're both drinking. And then Rafal eventually reveals that it's poisoned. But he only poisoned his own cup. And he killed himself in pursuit of his own dreams. So then we progress along to a pair of people. Grass and Oxy. Now, Grass and Oxy are two kind of like mercenaries in a way. And so we first see Oxy dueling a man instead of another like higher up person. And so we kind of get an idea these are kind of martial men. And so they end up eventually getting a job from the church. And from this job, they end up, I guess. Well, okay, hold up. I discuss Grass a little bit more. Now, Grass, he is a man who has lost his entire family, and he attempted to kill himself at one point, but then he was ultimately brought back, and he's living for, I can't remember exactly what it was. I believe he was living for some purpose that was important to him. It was dreaming, I believe, dreaming and having faith and discovery. I might be wrong on that, but because he's not that important of a character further on. But yeah, they end up getting put on this job to help transport a heretic, and they get talking with this dude, and Grass is like, "Hold up, I kind of agree with this man." So they help him escape. Grass and Oxy do, and so they get knocked out of the the area, the little carriage that they were in. They started to run away, but eventually the Inquisitors turn on them, and Nowak's with them, and Nowak goes to kill Oxy because he's kind of laying there. He's wounded a little bit, but the heretic ends up standing in his way, so Oxy can get away. And Oxy and Grass end up getting away, and they discover the stone box as well. And they're looking into it, and they're like, "Whoa, this is really valuable." And Grass ends up taking the little orb necklace, because at first, Rafal found the orb necklace, and he was wearing it, and Nowak notices this necklace, and this is important later on. But we see Nowak with the necklace on, and then Grass and Oxy at one point are on a bridge, and the bridge collapses, and Grass. Okay, so I think they're running from someone. I think they're running after having discovered other stuff because they're still being actively pursued since they're convicts now. But they're running, and Oxy is on the edge because it breaks, and he's holding Grass, and Grass is like, "No, I've done whatever I can, man." And Grass lets go and lets Oxy have the orb necklace. So now Oxy wears the orb necklace. So this progresses along until eventually Oxy runs into a monk by the name of Bedeni. Now Bedeni is Bedeni. I think it only has a sub, so I don't know the really kind of English way to pronounce it, but that's how his name is pronounced in Japanese. But I know it's the same way really, but there is different enunciation and stuff like that. But yeah, so we progress along, and these two meet up. Now Bedeni is a monk who's already been punished for his over curiosity because he wanted to look into some forbidden text, and he did so, but at the risk of his own eye, because he lost one of his eyes via pouring candle wax onto it by another monk because he looked into forbidden text that he wasn't supposed to. He didn't have the rank to. And so, but then he is kind of jaded towards the church, but he is also a staunch follower of God, even though he doesn't always express it. He can deny some things which may be considered heretical, but eventually Bedeni and Oxy come in cahoots, and Oxy introduces Bedeni to the ideas of heliocentrism and all that. He ends up bringing it to Bedeni, and Bedeni's like, "Oh, okay, I can get into this." And so Bedeni begins to become interested in heliocentrism. He begins to research it, and he makes his perfect paper. He does everything. But the thing about Bedeni is that he does not want to have a successor. He wants all of the work to be attributed to him, and if he dies on the way, he wants it all destroyed because it's his work. And so Bedeni is researching, and eventually he finds and creates the perfect thesis on heliocentrism. And with that, well, this is, I got a little bit ahead of myself, but through this, they are looking for a way to prove heliocentrism, and they end up posting a problem on this challenge board that rich people would put problems they had and offer rewards for who could answer them. Now, we see this young girl by the name of Holenta, and Holenta is kind of the ghostwriter for this scholar at the time, and he's at university, but since she is a woman, she's not getting accredited for her writings. And that really sucks because Holenta is a very intellectual individual and a very good writer. And she just wants to be recognized. And so we see this, and she ends up passing by the board, and she sees this problem, and she's like, "Okay, I have access to the book." She goes into her, her, I guess, acquaintance, kind of. She goes into his office, gets the books, solves the problem, posts it back, and Oxy and Bedeni see her, and they see that it's a woman. So they go up and they talk to her, and they're like, "Can we borrow your materials and all that?" And they're like, "Yeah." And with this, they come in contact with the owner of the university. And he is a man who has been dedicated to proving geocentrism throughout his entire life because his previous master had wanted to make a complete diagram of the cosmos. And therefore, this man is dedicated to geocentrism. And eventually, but then he's like, I'm studying heliocentrism, and this dude is absolutely dejected. He's like, "No." And eventually, he proves to him that heliocentrism is a thing. And I mean, though he doesn't accept it, he realizes that he can be wrong, and this breaks him, and he's allowed to. And Badini and Oxy are allowed to use the materials. And so, throughout all this, they are working in a cabin. In this cabin, Oxy is tasked with digging under the cabin. And through all this, we see as Oxy is going around feeding homeless people. Now, eventually, we see Badini go up, and he offers one of the homeless people some money to do a certain thing for him. Now, this is a little bit of a tangent that's not really expected until later on. But, yeah, so this is done, and that progresses, and then Badini finishes up his thesis on heliocentrism, and it's perfected, it's done. And he destroys all the other materials, so nothing can be found. But eventually, we end up seeing as Badini and Holenta and Oxy are at a bar because they're finally glad they completed this, they figured it out, and then Nowak comes in. And then we learn that Nowak is Holenta's father. And Nowak's there, he's chatting him up, and eventually they leave, and Holenta leaves, Holenta and Nowak, and then Nowak comes back. Because Nowak has not let his daughter know what he does as a job. And he's talking with Oxy and Badini, and he figures out, he gets a hunch that they're discovering heliocentrism. And so they go back to the cabin, they're like, we gotta get going, we gotta figure this out. And so they end up preparing everything, getting ready to leave, and then Nowak ends up pulling up. And through all this, we see as Badini goes away for a little while, but he ends up eventually turning himself in. And Oxy kind of stands his ground. He takes down a couple of the Inquisitors, and then he fights Nowak, and Nowak ultimately beats him. But yeah, that was a really cool scene. That's the thing. This show doesn't have a lot of action sequences, but they are good when they do have them. But yeah, so they both ultimately end up getting captured, and the only reason that Nowak ever figured out that they were actually heliocentrists because he went to investigate the cabin before all this happened, and he didn't see anything because they hit it perfectly before he came. But then Nowak saw the little orb necklace, and he's like, I know where I saw that, because he was the same person who interrogated Rafal. But yeah, so that ends up happening. They both end up getting captured, and throughout all this, as I mentioned prior, there was a brief encounter between Badini and another monk. Now, this other monk was asking about prior philosophers and stuff like that, and he just wanted to learn more about him. And Badini kind of helped him along with that. And then we progress in Badini and Oxy's story. They are ultimately home, and it's a beautiful scene as they look at the stars and all that. They're discussing kind of their last things, and it's a beautiful scene. But then we end up going to this monk that Badini had kind of was owed a favor by, and he gets a letter after this, and the letter that Badini was writing throughout the entire escapade or the battle as the Inquisitors came was to this man. And so he goes to this man, he's like, okay, I need you to do something. And what he needs them to do is pull up to a bunch of these homeless people who all shave their heads simultaneously, and they have pages of knowledge tattooed into their head. And yeah, that is how Badini's full, thesis survived after his death and after the destruction of all the materials and stuff like that. But yeah, so then we move along and we are introduced to this character by the name of Draka. Now, Draka is a money-hungry individual, and she lives with her uncle and they're nomads. And eventually one day, Draka and the other nomads are found out by a group of Inquisitors. Not they're Inquisitors, they're like a bishop, they're a holy group. They are Inquisitors, but also kind of a holy group. And they come and they see that Holenta is, they're asking specifically for a valuable person or something like that. And so Holenta's uncle ends up offering her up to the church against her will, and they end up ultimately killing her uncle because they realize, hey, we could use Holenta, but we're not going to capture Holenta because the bishop ended up taking a liking to her. And so that moves along, and Holenta ultimately ends up coming into ownership of a thesis, which is on the movements of the earth. And with that, eventually we see as the Heretic Liberation Army comes after her. Now, this happens 15 years after the execution of Oxy and Badini, and the execution of Oxy, the events of Oxy and Badini and all those happened 10 years after the death of Rafal. So this is 25 years after the death of Rafal, the beginning of the story. So 25 years after that. And we see the Heretic Liberation Army, they come and they've learned that she is in possession of this book. And when they come to get it, she ends up burning it. And they're like, okay, we're going to kill you now. But she's like, no, I have it all memorized, so you can't do that. So they end up taking her to her leader. And their leader is Holintha. Holintha ultimately ended up surviving because what happened to her after the execution of Badini and Oxy was she was taken captive by a different inquisitor because he believed that she was in cahoots with Oxy and Badini, but believed that Nowak was too biased and wouldn't take her in. And so he ends up taking her in, and he has these two amateur torturers who are actually the apprentices of Nowak, torturing her. They actually only ever remove one tooth. One of them gets to feeling bad, and they end up releasing her, and she runs off. And Nowak presumes that his daughter is dead. And then so after this, we move along, and she's like, okay, if you will write all this down for me, then I will let you use our printing press that we have, because she wants to spread the word on the movements of the earth. So then she ends up writing it all down, and just as everything seems like it'll be going well, the Inquisitors end up pulling up and finding them. And during this, everyone else is able to flee, all the script is made, and they run. Holintha stays back, and Holintha is too far away for the Inquisitors to see really clearly, but she's out there, and she ends up blowing up the whole house, including herself where they were at. And everything goes flying, and a hand lands right in front of Nowak. They were so close, yet so far, because they would have known each other if they had just been a day of time or if they'd been closer. And he ends up keeping this hand because he has a hunch. And so the hand is kept, and just like how he kept her gloves that he ended up finding. And so they move along, and eventually we end up meeting at this camp area where the printing press is, and they start pumping out pages. And we see as Draka, who is parentless as well, and the only thing she has left of her parents is these coins, bloody coins from her father, and this scarf thing. Well, while they're trying to run away from the Inquisitors, someone ends up needing the scarf. So what happens is they're transporting the script, and the Inquisitors come up, and they're like, yo, could I have something for the code? No, for this torch. Yeah, he needed to wrap a torch. And they're looking around, they're shuffling the back of their stuff, and they're like, oh, wait, hold up. They don't want them to find it. And so Draka ends up giving up her scarf thing, and the man's good and satisfied. So they end up getting to the safe house. And then they realize, oh, one of these script press print things are broken, one of the print blocks. And Holintha ends up giving her coins so they can boil them down to lead and make the thing again. So they end up pumping in a couple of the pages of the script. But then one of the... so we meet a big three in the Heretic Liberation Army, which is Schmidt, who's kind of the captain. When we have Lewandowski, who has a cool haircut, white hair. And then Frey. And Frey's just kind of a black-haired guy. But we see, and they're printing along there, everything's going good, but then we see as, Frey is talking with Schmidt, and he looks, and Frey's kind of discussing about how the horses are the only way to escape, and Frey killed the horses. Frey is a traitor, he had reported them to the bishop, and the Inquisitors are now coming to their safe spot. And so Frey and Schmidt get in a duel. This is a really sick duel. They end up fighting, and Frey loses, and everyone's like, oh crap, we gotta run. And so they end up preparing a plan. Their plan is to make sure that Draka gets away because she is the one piece. She is the one who has all of the scripture memorized. And so they end up doing this, and they defend her to the very end, and Schmidt is kind of like the last one standing for her, and Schmidt ends up going against multiple Inquisitors and Nowak, and he ends up fighting, but then eventually he is ultimately stabbed by Nowak, and eventually Draka ends up escaping to her bishop friend that she made earlier on in the story, and she's kind of talking about him. She's like, okay, I gotta get this published and all that, and she's like, we can make profit off of it and everything can be good. Because this dude's bound by profit. He's not that holy of a man. But, so that moves along. And we get to the point where Nowak ends up pulling up on the church. He kills the bishop in the church because he realizes that he's not really a man of God. And he sets it ablaze. Now, him and Draka get into a brief scuffle. He ends up stabbing Draka, but Draka gets him back as well. So he's left bleeding from the chest in the church. And he has a vision of her fall before he ends up dying. But before also he ends up dying, he grabs the hand from his coat, grabs the glove, and puts it on. He realizes it fits. So he knows that Holentha was the leader of the Heretic Liberation Army. And then we see as Draka, she runs along, she has a pigeon. Now, before Holentha had died, she ended up giving Draka a letter that she needed to be sent. We don't really ever know what was in the letter, but that ends up happening. And then Draka ends up running out. She releases the pigeon from the cage, and then she dies on a rock. So this message ended up getting delivered. But then we swap to the final viewpoint, which is Albert. Now, Albert is a orphan boy once more, and he was a young child who was tutored by who we're led to believe is Rafal. Now, this cannot be Rafal because at the time of the story, Albert is 23. Now, Rafal died 25 years in the past, so it is utterly impossible for Rafal to have been the teacher of Albert. Now, I believe the best interpretation of this is that the Rafal is simply a icon of heliocentrism, and it's not actually the physical embodiment of Rafal, it's just how the dramatized version of the anime shows us it is Rafal, even though it's not physically Rafal, it's just an icon of heliocentrism. And we see that Albert was a very studious little boy, and he ended up coming in contact with this tutor, and the tutor put him on heliocentrism, and ended up taking to this intellectual society. And one day when they were there, and the first day, he forgot his astrolabe. He forgot to make his observations that night, so he ends up running home and to see that this icon of Rafal had killed his dad. That's how his father died, and he's confessing this all to a priest in the present time. And so he ends up running along, and he's like, "Oh, he killed my dad," and so he becomes staunchly against scholasticism. Until after his confession, he leaves the booth after talking with the priest, and he's walking down the road, and he draws the constellations out in the star that the icon of Rafal showed him. And he's like, you know what? I want to be a scholar again. And then the story ends with a brief timeline of how heliocentrism came to the populace. And that was just a really good story. And I think the best way, it's a very unique anime because, it is a very philosophical anime because every single character has something philosophical to say. And it's always very in-depth and really interesting. Now, sometimes it does get a little bit tedious, but I don't think it overstays its welcome with that. And I believe anyone who is a big fan of scholasticism, like I am, will really enjoy Orb because it just made so many good arguments for scholasticism and for discovery and for curiosity. So, yeah, I believe it is really good. And like I said, it has really good action too. Even if you're just an action enjoyer, I think you will like Orb because of the brief action scenes because they are phenomenal. It's a beautiful anime for animation wise, and it's just all around a really, really good anime. I was not expecting to enjoy it as much as I did, but I ultimately loved it. It was phenomenal. And so, I said, I think the only gripe I could have is occasionally the philosophical discussions get a little tedious, but that's kind of in the blander areas. At the beginning of the Draka arc, then yeah, that's kind of where it gets it. But Oxy, Badeni, Holentha, Rafal, and Albert's sagas are all really, really good. So yeah, I would highly recommend Orb to anyone who's even speculating it. I know I didn't really ever hear anyone talk about it, but yeah, I would highly recommend it. It's on Netflix. But yeah, so the next anime I'm watching right now, actually I just started today and I'm 13 episodes in, is Hunter x Hunter, and I'm already really enjoying it. So I will probably have a video on the first arc of that sometime soon. So yeah, thank you very much for watching episode 25 of Shelf Review and my review of Orb on the Movements of the Earth. So yep, thank you very much for watching.